Beautiful people. Hopefully, I am audible. If there are any issues with the audio, please do let me know in the chat. Apologies to friends who are streaming, like Radlib and I think Geo and Prude were streaming a bit earlier. And of course, we're all going to be coming up hard against the release of the Putin interview with Tucker Carlson. Apologies to friends, but I had this scheduled sometime in advance with AM. I'm very, very happy to have him here. Apologies to Apostolic Majesty for not having links to his channel included below. I hope, nevertheless, that everyone will look him up and follow him here on YouTube, his various platforms. You can also follow him certainly over on Twitter. I encourage you to do so. Unfortunately, I got a channel strike, and so I'm not allowed to post links for the time being until that strike lapses. So I'm very, very happy to be joined today by AM. We have an ongoing series, for those of you who do not know. It's called the History of Today, and we alternate between his channel and mine. Again, everyone should follow him over at his channel. There's, an enormous amount of content there that does not go out of date because of the nature of his subject, and he is quite good at it, indeed. So today we're going to be talking about this idea that that came to me sometime back, and it's been bouncing, into the foreground of my awareness on occasion. And so I decided, really, this is a perfect thing to discuss with AM because of his knowledge of history. The idea basically is a sort of imperial diversity. Now, I just threw that term around imprecisely, lazily. I expect that with AM, we'll be able to get into really what is meant by imperial, but in a very loose and imprecise sense. What I'm talking about is this idea that you have political structures or power structures that themselves include any number of constituent nations and confessions, sectarian groups, and the rest, whether they be explicitly religious or not. And that there is a historical way in which we have seen how these groups are managed in various ways, exploited, if you like, as well, certainly. And so one of the things that really stuck out for me was in the old Ottoman system. They had groups that were called millets, from mille, an Arabic word, and it roughly means nations. The Turks also referred to their the constituent groups of this sort as raya. I think it comes from Arabic raya. I can't do that ayn sound very well, but at any rate, this means flocks. And the idea is that the shepherd manages and organizes the flocks and shears them, presumably, in order to exploit them, to make the most of them as a tax base and the rest. In the Ottoman system, they were above slaves, but they were not like the full Ottoman Muslim citizen, many of whom could, in that group, many of whom could indeed do military service. But we see the vestiges of this, the historical aspect of it today. For example, in Turkey, when I lived there, the neighborhoods, they call them mahalle, and these neighborhoods are associated with certain groups. These groups that within the imperial structure are to a certain groups that are within the imperial structure to a certain extent deterritorialized. And they attempt to impose some degree of territorial control at the level of neighborhoods. So you go into a Kurdish neighborhood, and where I lived in a Kurdish neighborhood, because I was not a Kurd and I was therefore suspect, I would come home in the morning with buckets of feces having been dumped in my entranceway to my apartment. There are likewise, neighborhoods you go that are Roma in Istanbul, Çingene, where the neighborhoods, they don't want you in there because it's their group. And we see how this is carried out in a contemporary setting with Turkish neighborhoods in Germany, where if you go into the neighborhood, you'll look, and particularly like on a Turkish national holiday, you're in the middle of Germany, and yet you see Turkish flags hanging from every window. And we can see it in Syria, an area that was once upon a time administered by the Turk, where you've got a patchwork of villages. You know, you've got a Chechen village and a Turkmen village, and you've got Alawite control of major cities and Circassian villages, because these deterritorialized groups that are deprived of actual state control within some territorial boundary that they administer, they attempt to create some analog of it. And a degree of that is tolerated. And as we'll see, I think that there are relations there with the idea of what are called communities today, how we're concerned about this or that community, and the tension and frictions that exist in potential between the various communities have to be managed by the state. And so, you'll have things like Sharia courts handling some things, if not explicitly accepted by the state organization. They'll be tolerated on the fringes. And with the Ottoman Empire, you had the idea that Armenian communities, Jewish communities, Christian communities would be permitted a certain amount of leeway, and certain things were handled, by they themselves, so long as they continued to pay the taxes that were required of them, the flocks being shorn. And I think there's quite a bit about this that we can develop. One of the examples that brought all this to mind, before I turn it over to AM to share his sort of opening thoughts on all of this, and perhaps he can direct us in terms of how we proceed from here. I noticed there was an article on the 30th of January in the Daily Mail, and I believe the headline, I think I got the quote right, is President Erdogan sets up political party for people with foreign roots that will, quote, stand against anti-Muslim racism in Germany, after the country's new laws, that those being Germany's new laws, granted 1.5 million Turks the vote. And so this brings up the last point I wanted to add to this mix, at least for the moment. There's more, which is that this provides a lever into which outside powers can insert, their shaft, and leverage and push around a country from outside. And we certainly saw this during the Ottoman period, when the French would come in and say that they had an obligation to protect the rights of the Catholics in the Ottoman Empire, when the Tsar said that he had an obligation to get involved in Ottoman internal politics because of the Orthodox population there, of which he was or of whom he was a kind of protector. Likewise with the British claiming a right to protect Protestants within the imperial domain. So there's another dimension there. And so that, by way of introduction, welcome, AM. Thank you for patiently sitting through my opening monologue. What are your thoughts on this? What do you think needs to be said by way of introduction, and where do you think we should go?
Uh, well, first of all, thank you, Semyogog, for your many accolades regarding my competency in my channel. Thank you very much, and I'm very sorry to hear that your channel has received a strike. I hope that is cleared up soon. As for my general thoughts this evening, obviously, one of the advantages of this series, History of Today, is to find various analogies, not only across time, across place, but also in terms of referencing what is going on today. So, this whole notion of looking back, in your case, say, for example, Oliver, the Turkish example, in my case, I would be focusing more on the Austrians, on Russia. I'd also like to bring in some other myriad examples as well, but that's principally my area of expertise, so to speak. All of these things are linking back to something that's very much occurring today, which is the all of these ethnic groups almost following some sort of preset plan all across the world now, all across the Western world, adopting a similar pattern of assimilating into these close-knit communities, or MIE, which you, I'm probably mispronouncing that, which you brought up earlier, and the idea of facilitating the creation of a millet, or a nation within a nation, or within a broader empire. And by extension, this conversation allows us to go into the nature of empire, the nature of balancing, essentially overseeing the management of vast and multifaceted states regarding ethnic constituents and regarding religious constituents. But this also brings into a conversation ways in which you could talk about the competency of such a systems, the advantages, the drawbacks of such a system, and how all of this is relevant today regarding certain groups, certain confessions, how this can all be related back to, are we talking about dynasty, are we talking about aristocracy, are we talking about a shadow elite, etc. And something which I find quite a good way from my angle of setting this off regarding the communities, and you could say the Ottomanization of the West that is going on today, which is very much the backdrop in which we're talking. A week ago, there was an acid attack in London, perpetrated, I believe, by a man called Abdul Zedi. And this morning, the Metropolitan Police put out a video in which they put front and center a man called Darius Nassimi, and he is from the Afghanistan and Central Asian Association, which is a quote-unquote support group for refugees. It is a NGO, it is a humanitarian organization. But the Met Office had basically delegated the responsibility of appealing to the public, quote-unquote, to this charity member from this ACAA, which is an Afghan organization speaking, I forget the language, Pashtun. You may be able to correct me in terms of the majority language of Afghanistan. And all of this, I think, cements the point to me that we see national institutions or imperial institutions, law enforcement agencies, in this case the Metropolitan Police, are delegating the responsibility of dealing with certain subsets or certain communities, certain groups, to these, you can say, more specific organizations focusing on, I mean, there's some sort of sick irony in a way that these sort of organizations are responsible for bringing these people in, and now they are being leaned on again by law enforcement in terms of being able to further manage the relationships between these sort of people. So in a sense, you can say that these organizations, these NGOs, do represent a form of uh, decentralized elite operating within an imperial superstructure. And as an example, I think that can proliferate over many periods and places. So that is what I really want to get at today. And I think it's a fascinating conversation really to cover. And of course, when we're talking about empires today, the most obvious ones that come to mind obviously are the American Empire, however you're going to define that, China, and indeed you can say Russia, and how these respective powers and smaller nations, you mentioned Erdogan and Turkey, use the whole idea of nationalism and minorities in terms of not just looking at imperial relations within their own borders, but in terms of being able to agitate in other powers. That's also a key component, especially when it comes to the example of the Ottoman Empire. But I think that this conversation can't really go forward until we discuss what is an empire. An empire is a term which is very often used and very often misapplied. And I'm going to try and boil this down and make it as simple as possible. And I'm going to use Rome as my example because I think it's the most obvious and clear one. And it's also where we get these terms: imperium, dominate, dominion, all of these terms. Because Rome began as a ethno-state. It began as a city-state, which consolidated into a Latin identity, which then consolidated into a Italian identity, which wasn't necessarily synonymous with the city-state, especially if you look at the Servile Wars. But as the empire, quote unquote, expanded, it had to manage relationships with not only Italic peoples, but with a whole myriad of peoples from across the Mediterranean and later the entire European world. And as a result of that, not only did the ethnic composition of the state change, but the political system changed with it. Rome became far more militaristic. Power was essentially taken away from the local organizations of the city-state and became focused on military strongmen. And one military strongman, Julius Caesar, had a definitive effect on the empire in terms of being able to transition it into something resembling that of a monarchy, and perhaps later you can even say autocracy. And here we arrive at the Roman Empire, and in particular a concept dividi et impera, which is divide and conquer, dominate, and take all of these organizations, pit them against each other. It is now a matter of managing these various groups. So in that respect, we have empire. In a sense, you can say it's deracinated. It is focused on control. It is focused on maintaining the endurance of a particular regime. And in many ways, you can say that this is a universal concept in terms of applying imperium, meaning command or dominion over a certain group. It could be applied to, say, for example, the emperors in China. It could be applied to the Mongols. It could be applied to the Habsburgs, all of these different groups. You could even broaden the term and say it doesn't even have to relate to a military elite or a dynastic elite. It can relate to some sort of ideological dominion. Back in the medieval period, you can say this relates to the empire of the Catholic Church, or more specifically, the empire of the papacy as an aspect of that. And then today, you can say that there is a imperial project in terms of being able to be assimilated into LGBT identity, and how the fealty to that certain ideology in many ways is a fundamental asset in terms of being able to manage these diverse and similarly disparate groups. So within the context of empire, I think establishing that context is absolutely necessary. And the core thing that distinguishes empire in relation with early Rome, for example, is it is not a nation. Yeah, many people say, for example, look at France. You don't tend to think of France as an empire, despite the fact that there are Bretons, there are Occitan speakers, there are Germans in Alsace, etc. So how do we really draw the line between nation and empire? You could almost say the more diverse it becomes, by nature, it almost becomes more imperialistic in terms of its management. Um, you can say a nation in its pure form can actually represent a form of primitive democracy, going back to the tribe, going back to the clan, going back to the tribal elders, patriarchy. I mean that in its truest sense, not in a rather debased sense that we understand it now. And all of this, of course, is undergirding loyalty. There is some sort of shared heritage. There is a communal ethos. Everyone is somewhat related to each other. Once you lose that, you see almost the transition into it becoming a nation, into becoming a dominion, into becoming a power. And that is how I would like to start off in terms of being able to distinguish between nation and empire. Because looking at these examples, very rarely do you have a majority ethnic group, which is it is simply a matter of the majority ethnic group dominating over other groups. As we see with the Ottomans, it seems to actually be the inverse of that until we see the advent of Turkish quote unquote nationalism. So nationalism and imperialism seem to be quite contrasting, or you can say even juxtaposing assets of political science. But that's the end of my rant, I think.
Yeah, I wouldn't characterize it as a rant at all. I think these are all excellent points that we're going to have to bear in mind, especially this notion of divide and conquer, because we see. I mean, think about the kind of difficulties that are confronted by states with this heterogeneous composition. We see what is going on with the Quebecois and the rest within Canada, and that was prior to their, in my view, ill-advised importation of huge replacement populations, or at least let's say opportunistic migrant populations. Look at what you see with the dissolution of the artificial state of the South Slavs, Yugoslavia, with its sectarian conflict, or look even at a country like Belgium, where you could really just have sort of a fairly small country these days, anyway, having been divested of its possessions abroad, where you have, Dutch and French speakers, and it's essentially this press into which these two groups have been jammed, and so we see it used everywhere for very good reason, and of course I want to underscore quite explicitly that everything we're discussing today assumes the importation of populations, the intentional movement of populations in order to make uh, in order to remove any possibility of a nation with its own national interests forming and becoming sort of like something that sticks in the craw of the globalist mm, project. So we see that being applied everywhere. One of the things that I'm hoping will come out of this, and here I'll turn it over to you, Am, because you have knowledge of these various empires vastly exceeding mine. As I said, I can keep up with the Ottoman stuff, but that's about the extent of it. What are the prospects? And you don't have to address this certainly right away, but I'm hoping we can touch on this as well. What are the prospects? What is the trajectory of these various imperial projects in terms of their attempts to manage this diversity within their domains? The Ottomans certainly found it ultimately unsustainable, and a large part of Ataturk's project, as you know, Am, was to attempt to create a national footing for the country. The removal of the Arabic alphabet, replacing it with their own script, um, insisting for a period of time that was not insignificant that the call to prayer be made in Turkish rather than the muezzin doing their prayers in Arabic. All sorts of rather far-fetched ideas about a Güneş dili, a sun language that was in fact the world's first language, and that the Turks could attempt to restore this primeval splendor of their language that was the first on earth. So they had to undertake an enormous project in order to sort of put themselves on a national footing. And very interestingly, that included a fixed set of borders. There was one spot down in the south um, that still juts out of the southern part of Turkey, that when Ataturk died had not been brought into the country. And eventually it was, I think it was under İnönü. Nevertheless, that had been planned in advance, and they wanted these fixed borders. And so there's also another sense that is very interesting to me of a fluidity of borders, which we see with the neighborhoods, the deterritorialization. It permits certain games to be played by not fixing a border. And indeed, we see them attempting to remove borders. But I would point everyone's. We see them removing borders in the case of Britain, in the case of the southern border with the United States, with all their various games. But there was, in fact, a thing that's very notable about Israel with Sharon. He had a concept of fluid borders. You can hear more about this if you go look at the Alistair Crook interview on Judge Napolitano's channel from January 22nd. But he basically, Sharon played a game where there wasn't really a fixed border for Israel. They just sort of moved it as they wished. And of course, they do it internally as well. But they've basically, they just keep extending up into southern Lebanon. So there's this interesting aspect of deterritorialization as well that very much stands out for me. But now I've introduced a couple of further elements, and we haven't even really dug into the background as regards these other empires and what lessons we might take from them as regards what's going on today. But just to make sure that those are in there, there's the idea of fluid borders, a certain kind of ambiguity and deterritorialization, and the question of what are the prospects of the empires that attempt to manage their populations in this fashion.
Yes, very quickly, you bring up quite a few points there. One regarding Ataturk. It is almost a brilliant example in terms of, you could say, Ataturk representing the revolt against empire, a revival of Turkish nationalism against the uh, I'm not going to say globalist, but in terms of an imperialist project associated with the Ottomans, we have the office of the Caliphate. The Caliphate implies dominion over all Islam. The whole idea of being an Ottoman Sultan is to have dominion, but you're also Khan of the world. The Ottoman project is universal. It was meant to include various peoples who attempted to codify this in the 19th century with the whole project of Tanzimat and Ottomanism. As you mentioned, we have Arabic inferences and liturgy used, and you can say an integral part of Islam. And so the fascinating thing, as with many Christian subsets such as Anglicanism, is the idea of territorializing and nationalizing a majority religion such as Islam, and even, say, for example, trying to distance the Turkish language from that of the Arabic world, and by extension, the whole project of Greater Islam, by, say, for example, switching the alphabet from the Arab script to the Latin script. Just one example to build on there. Someone else, I think, regarding my point, which needs to be qualified, regarding the purpose of empire as being the project of a specific ethnic group simply to dominate that ethnic group. When that group is the majority, that is seldom the case. And I'm actually going to use the examples this person brings up, Konstock, in the chat. When it comes to Assyria, the ethnicities aren't very clearly defined, and we're still talking about the period of nation states, and we're talking about lingua franca, such as the use of Aramaic and Akkadian. So to talk necessarily about an Assyrian nation as opposed to an Assyrian dynasty or the Neo-Assyrian Empire is rather contentious. In the same way, Persia was not simply the desire of a Persian people, which was really only coming into existence the tail end of the first millennium BC, to dominate for the sake of the Persian people. Rather, it was a project by the Achaemenid dynasty to control everything, to control many groups through the uses of local rulers called satrapies. In the same way that Rome, the minute it became an empire, all of a sudden its elite ceased to be Roman and they became more quote unquote universalized. You have Syrian emperors, you have Libyan emperors, you have Armenian emperors. Rome itself becomes deracinated from the city and is moved over to Constantinople and becomes primarily Greek speaking. In the same case in Britain, you have French kings, then you have Welsh kings, then you have Scottish kings, then you have Hanoverian kings. The elite itself, which is ruling Britain, is not necessarily trying to you can almost say national socialism in regards to this is actually an aberration. But again, the point is that, and the last example, China, the last Chinese empire was dominated by an ethnic minority called the Manchus. So all of the examples actually further cement my point that empires, as opposed to nations, don't tend to dominate for the sake of the majority ethnic group, but rather for some other elite, for some other organization. Now, you bring up the point, Semigog, of nations having borders, and obviously that's a part of the Ataturk project. But when it comes to this idea of moving borders, I mean, to push back slightly against your Israel example, within the process of the French Revolution, you have this idea of natural borders, i.e., nations come about. They're an apotheosis in the sense of representing a crystallization of the popular will, a democratic sort of participatory demos, which can decide for themselves and are going to become actualized in some way or another. In order to have this form of actualization, they need to be able to defend themselves. In order to defend themselves, they need quote unquote natural boundaries. For the French revolutionaries, they believe the natural boundaries extend to the Pyrenees, the Atlantic, to the English Channel, to the Mediterranean, to the Alps, and to the River Rhine. And they expand in all these directions in order to shore up this national border. In the case of Israel, I would actually say, rather than following from this process of deterritorialization, I would say it was an aggressive pursuit of quote unquote natural borders, because Israel is not principally placed in terms of being able to defend itself, hence why you annex parts of Lebanon, which are very mountainous. You annex the Golan Heights. During the 1960s, you push the border up into the Suez Canal. You expand up into the Arabian Desert. All of these places which would try and form the basis of some sort of natural geographic boundaries in order to stake out the preservation of your nation into perpetuity. And empire, by contrast, stands in total contrast to that, because empire is not defined by boundaries. Empire is defined by universalism. Its boundaries are fluid and they can extend anywhere for any reason. The only aberration when it comes to nationalism, say, for example, will be irredenta, the idea of returning provinces that were supposedly part of the nation. This, say, for example, can appeal to France, Germany, Italy, etc. But regarding empires, empires have no such restrictions. There is no desire to take back one particular territory just because it has an ethnic group. They can expand anywhere, and they can use various ethnicities in order to do it. So, for example, in the Russian Empire, let's appeal to the Armenians, let's appeal to the Georgians, let's appeal to the Bulgarians to tear up the Ottoman Empire and expand the scope of our own empire. And you can expand this whole notion of the deterritorialized nature of empire, because again, you can say it's a project about dominion. Whatever way you try and construe or justify that dominion doesn't have to be confined by a set of arbitrary boundaries. So really, just to buttress your point in terms of being able to draw the distinction between nations and quote unquote actualized nations existing within defensible natural borders, and the idea of the empire as universal. So, for example, the Ottomans, they don't simply exist around a Anatolian core. They expand up into the Persian Gulf. They expand as far as Morocco. They go south into Sudan. They go far north into Ukraine, into Hungary. There is no reason why these borders have to be under the Ottoman project, but they are justified as part of the process of Ottoman universalism or Imperial universalism, in the same way that China, to bring up another example, China is a very contentious issue. People won't even refer to modern China as a ethno-state. They refer to it as a quote-unquote civilizational state. But in reality, the modern borders of China are the result of a series of imperialist conquests done by the Qing emperors in the 18th century, in particular the Emperor Qianlong, who expanded at the expense of the Muslims, the Zhungars, the Tibetans, the Mongols, often forming various alliances with these groups to establish an imperial state, which wasn't simply demarcated by allegiance to the Han Dynasty. Indeed, the Han Dynasty believed their interests were not represented at all. They represented some sort of antithesis to the imperialist projects of the Qing Dynasty. So that's just one example, Semigog. And, all of these facets, you can talk about various examples. I mean, I mentioned the Russian Empire, I mentioned the Ottomans, I've mentioned the Qing, to use various more sort of recent examples when looking at the Austrians. The Austrians are an interesting case because they are simultaneously imperialist, but they are also nationalist, which may come somewhat confusing to many people, because the Austrians didn't necessarily expand by conquest all the time. They expanded through marriage, by inheritance. And therefore, many nations came into their ken, came into their protection and their overlordship. And as a result, you have many territorialized units existing within a larger superstructure. So you have the lands of Bohemia, you have the lands of St. Stephen, you have the lands of the Archduchy of Austria, or you can say take Bohemia together in Austria, and you have the Urblande. And then you have more artificial contrivances, which many Austrians couldn't wrap their heads around, such as Galicia and Lodomeria. All of these territories, which are in some way linked back to a conception of national borders, yet a part of some sort of imperial superstructure. And indeed, coming up with the Austrians in particular, you can say the imperial superstructure is then buttressed and augmented by this idea of generalized imperium relating to the secular headship of the Catholic Church, which would extend into the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire, as an example, doesn't need to be buttressed by borders, but ultimately it became territorialized, it became nationalized, and became synonymous with German nationalism. So there are many interesting facets regarding this, and every empire has its own particular idiosyncrasies in terms of being able to organize these various groups. So obviously with China, modern China, the People's Republic of China, all of these things bear mentioning. You have aspects of imperial management. You have a majority Han dynasty, but not necessarily exclusive in terms of the Han being able to project some sort of mastery in and of itself, is attached to an imperialist universalist superstructure, which is that of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party, which justifies the territory of China as essentially multi-ethnic, which was something associated with the very early Chinese Republicans, and yet it is also indulging in, you can say, national irredenta in terms of trying to acquire Taiwan. So China is both imperialist and also appealing to aspects of nationalism as well. The same can be said of Russia. Russia is and always has been, ever since sort of the transition from Muscovy to the Tsardom of all the Russias, is an imperial project. Modern Russia, the Russians are the majority, but there are various ethnic cohorts in terms of Siberian groups, Chechens, Dagestanis, Kalmuks, Tatars. The list goes on. And in terms of being able to sort of reconcile this with a broader structure of empire, when it comes to Russia, and it comes to America, we have another point to consider, which is you have the de facto boundaries of an empire, such as the United States of America, but then you have the outer empire. In the Chinese example, this will be associated with the ideas of tributaries. You have the Middle Kingdom, Zhongguo, and then you have all of these other non-Chinese ethnicities or groups which are surrounding the imperial center, the civilization state, which in many ways is supposed to represent the zenith of human achievement in the case of China. In the case, and of course, bringing this back to the Achaemenids, the idea of a small elite ruling essentially through a system of satrapies, an extended sort of structure which goes across borders and goes across confessional groups such as they existed in the last centuries BC. In terms of the United States, we can see this applied to supranational organizations which aren't technically under the headship of the United States but de facto are, such as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the European Union, even. And then we take Russia, and the example will be dominion over the Commonwealth of Independent States. So there are many ideological facets, there are many institutions, organizations which are able to augment these disparate groups and form them into some form of imperial whole. And often, this is a point to consider in terms of juxtaposing this against the idea of nationalism, is often empires, as opposed to nations, will use the peoples on the periphery almost in a counterbalance to invert the process of nationalism, to the extent even of oppressing the national majority. In the case of the Qing, the Manchus were able to impose their dominion over the conquered Han peoples by forcing them to wear the Manchurian pigtail. Am I getting that right? I'm sorry, my brain is going.
The Q or whatever.
The Q, yes, the Q and the shaved, the semi-shaved forehead. And of course, that was a sign of dominion. You had the division of the army into the Manchu banners, which were the elite forces, and then the Chinese Green Standard Army. In the case of the Ottomans, the armies,
the wearing of the
yes,
fez.
The wearing of the fez, but before then, the wearing of the turban. In terms of the wearing of the turban itself was an elitist symbol. We have this idea of sumptuary laws demarcating groups, even baked into the whole codification of the management of groups as part of Islam. This may be rather controversial to say, but I don't really think it's sort of inaccurate in any way. But Islam, from its inception, was an imperialist project. It was a study in essentially how to control non-Islamic peoples, the dhimmi, or the people of the book. This is formulated with the quote-unquote covenant of Umar, or rather you could say its precedent begins there, in terms of being able to delineate the privileges between Muslims and non-Muslims, such as the wearing of the turban being one prominent example. But nevertheless, it's not just a matter of Muslims occupying an exalted position, because in the Ottoman state, Christian boy levies, as part of the Devashirme, would become part of the Janissary Corps, and they would become the elite military forces of the Ottoman Sultan. They were slaves to him, yet they also occupied a prominent position within the broad structure of the Ottoman Empire. So you can say that the imperial project employs, you can say, peripheries almost as mercenary groups, um, uh, almost at the expense in terms of being able to effectively popularize and mobilize the forces of the imperial core. When we move towards nationalism, we see the jettisoning of those various forces, and we see the creation of people's armies, i.e., the forces of conscription, which obviously come to fore during the 19th century, albeit really had begun in France. And a process of creating the French nation is a process of the levée en masse in terms of being able to mobilize the nation of France into the defense of the natural boundaries. So I'm throwing out a lot of concepts there, but hopefully people can gauge from some of what I said about the multifaceted nature in terms of what imperial dominion is and how the dominating force can interact with the various groups under its nominal command, and what legitimating forces. I would say, actually, Semigog, my favorite example of this from an ideological point of view isn't possibly even the Ottomans, but the Mughals. Um, because the Mughals are the example of this sort of par excellence in terms of representing a ethnic super minority, dominating through sort of dynastic and sort of ideological fiat alone. And what I mean by this, the house that dominated the Mughal Empire, as opposed to the Turks, which represented, not an overall majority in the Ottoman Empire at all times, but you can say a simple majority of the people, and they became associated with the House of Osman from its origins in the 13th century. But when we come to the Mughals, we have the House of Timur. People still debate the origins of Timur, but it's basically associated with the modern boundaries of Uzbekistan. Indeed, there is a nationalist movement in Uzbekistan which is trying to claim Tamerlane for themselves. But this group from Uzbekistan, or some people claim that he's Mongol, some people claim that he is Central Asian, but whatever. This group comes to occupy a position of strength and dominion over nearly the entire Indian subcontinent, i.e., there is barely any ethnic cohort in order to be able to buttress the powers of the Mughal Empire, and yet they do so by, on the one hand, appealing to a congenial culture, which they assimilate and are able to refine, which is that of Persian administration, which existed in India before their arrival, but they were able to inherit that system and perfect it. They intermarried with various local elites. They were able to assimilate Hindus, which weren't part of the protected class of Islam, into their structure of administration, often forming alliances of mutual advantage. And only tentatively did they even employ Islam as a ruling sort of ideology at all. And Akbar, the greatest of the Mughal emperors, even attempted to subvert the domination of Islam among his own imperial court by declaring Din Ilah, the imperial faith, that he almost would represent a god, and around him would represent all the satellite religions. And this represents another facet, say, for example, of Roman control, which is the idea of the Pontifex Maximus, the great bridge builder. You have the divine cult at the center, and around them you have the satellite religions of all the polytheistic beliefs of the empire, all assimilated into one whole, multi-confessional, multi-ethnic. You have the Romans in one example, and you have the Mughals in the other. In fact, it's only once the Mughals focus on the particular, i.e., they focus on Islamic nationalism, that the Mughal Empire begins to collapse, because it essentially betrayed that very effective means of being able to co-opt and manage these seemingly sort of uh, intractable groups together. Once that system breaks down, not only do the Mughals decline, but they decline at such an accelerated pace that it's almost impossible to qualify. From the beginning of the 18th century, say, for example, the Mughals nearly controlled the entire subcontinent. Within 50 years, they only control the city around Delhi, and the city itself is sacked by the Afghans. So that, in a way, is to explain how successful a diverse imperial project can be, yet at the simultaneously it explains how fragile that can be. It's because it's ultimately a process of managing relations between all of these different groups, and once the management of those relations becomes defective, it can spiral out of control very quickly. And I can bring other examples, but I think that's enough to sort of prove my point before bringing Semyagog back into this, because again, I've been ranting, but there we are.
Oh, that's the purpose. That's why I'm so happy to have you on as a guest. This immediately brings to mind a few things for me. One is, you talk about the Persians with the Persian inheritances in terms of the administration and even to a considerable extent, sort of the ideological um, underpinnings of, of how the imperial project is managed. There was a time, I've mentioned this in the past, where I was studying as trying to go as deeply as I could as related to this idea of taqiyya, or permissible dissimulation. And I remember I corresponded with a Baha'i woman who had been looking into this because, of course, the Baha'i religion comes out of it's essentially a kind of bringing down to date, to use Mark Twain's expression, of Persian elements of. Well, let me just say it this way: this Baha'i person had speculated that the real roots of taqiyya, or permissible dissimulation within the Persian context, and from there, to some extent, certainly carried over into the entire history of Islam and the Arabs and the rest. Certainly, the Ottoman Empire has aspects of this as well. The Cyrus, when he conquered a people, um, you did not see the kind of thing that you saw, for example, with the Jews when the walls of Jericho came tumbling down, and everything was slaughtered because there would be one God and the offending peoples would be removed. The Persians had very much an imperial project.
And just to bring that example, that again is why I think the Israel case today almost bears closer example to France during the 1790s, because of this, in terms of being able to impose a monotheistic and mono-ethnic worldview upon a certain defined territory, or the aspirations to one, so to speak.
Yes, it's almost as though we could sort of lay out a continuum with, at one end, this idea of a false promise of equality, um, or diversity at a minimum, right? Um, as a possibility of coexistence, and you just very neatly underscored how, in some respects, that would be flexible and therefore strong, because it could shift under varying pressures. And yet it had certain inbuilt flaws, which, if not attended to, could make it a very, very fragile thing. Then you could imagine, at the other end of this continuum, you have this monotheistic, in quotes, in a very broad sense, not strictly religious, as with your example of the revolutionary fervor. This monotheistic attempt to impose uniformity, and it itself can become very weak, much as, like, if you build something out of wood, and if you feel it flexing under you, that's a good thing. If you feel it not flexing at all, it could almost be brittle and suddenly break. I don't know how good that metaphor is, really, but
No,
perhaps.
I think that's valid, and I think that underscores a point that seldom has there been an empire which has been able to impose mass uniformity and total centralization. It just doesn't happen. All of these examples I've used have to rely on some form of ethnic delegation or ethnic management, and of course, the French project was not only to expand externally, but centralize all power within the government in Paris, which was in itself, a very radical scheme for that time. But ultimately it failed, and there was a huge pushback within France, let alone with the imperial satellites that it created. So, I mean, this ongoing contest. I mean, on the one hand, as with the Moguls, we have to manage groups which seem so disparate and geographically distant that one can't imagine all of these groups being associated with one particular power. But that's again one of the magic tricks of empire. But the other, of course, which you mentioned very early on, with your example about Ataturk and his attempt to create a Turkish nationalism out of the ruin and the delegitimated and humiliated Ottoman Empire after the First World War, is the ethnic pushback by the quote-unquote ruling ethnicity against the project of empire. Building on from your example of Cyrus and the creation of satrapies and the assimilation of all these groups, one such similar figure is Alexander. Alexander comes from the Greek example. The Greeks, especially in the south of Hellas, Athens, the Peloponnese, Thessaly, Aetolia, etc., are vehemently nationalistic in terms of their language, in terms of their culture, in terms of their entire historical outlook. Historia exists as a result of, say, for example, the Greeks and their relations with foreign powers. In the case of Herodotus and the Greco-Persian Wars, the genesis of sort of Greek and nationalism of antiquity is sort of forged in the fire of the hatred of the barbarians. And of course, in the Greek context, which is where barbarian comes from, non-Greek speakers. Then we have the arrival of a monarchy, a dynasty, which in many ways is considered anti-Greek, which is known for passing out and delegating power to other ethnic groups and forming power through alliances, such as that of Macedonia and Thessaly. This is the origin of the trying to remember, I think it's the Argead dynasty, where Alexander comes from. And Alexander takes and harnesses the power of Greece as their hegemon, and then expands and attempts to do what Cyrus did back to the Persian Empire and conquer the Achaemenids and establish himself as the quote-unquote Lord of Asia. All of a sudden, you have a you have an ethnos, again, all of these terms specifically related to Greece. You, of course, have diversity within that ethnos when it comes to the various tribes, but ultimately, the ethnos is now responsible for managing the imperial legacy of the Achaemenids. One would say that this is antithetical. And of course, there was such a pushback that Alexander had to face a mutiny. There were attempts to assassinate him. He had attempted to broach this project by mass marrying his generals into the assimilated cultures that they had conquered. Alexander himself had done this with Roxana. And so by the end of this process, we see the Greek world has expanded into a homonoia, or a generalized concept of dominion over all the world, over all peoples. And as a result, you can say that this creates an empire, but it destroys Greece in the process. Greece becomes divided. There are constant wars between the Diadochi, and it's this very diversity which destroys the nation of Greece and allows for another empire, or rather two empires, the Parthians and the Romans, to pick on the corpse. So again, to emphasize the point that empire seems antithetical to nationalism, that if we're simply looking at one national group projecting power outwards, it's really that simple. And I would bring the example of Alexander back to the example of the British, whereby we have an expansion of power across the entire world to the point that power relations and the aspirations of empire itself, what it could mean, they're defined by new limits. The British Empire was the largest empire in the world, and I don't think it could have been conceivable that such disparate places such as Canada and India could share the same government, yet they did. Yet as a result of the creation of empire, we see the dissolution of the nation. And I've recently on my own channel been discussing Enoch Powell as the last Briton. And the reason I say that is because Britain could not survive the process of imperial truncation to go from empire to nation state. Rather, the process of empire building simply relates to the substitution of one empire for another, and the nation state cannot survive that transition. So rather, we have the process of empire into the conquered, or the creation of a client state. And all of these things bear relation in terms of how we can construe empire today, and perhaps even the fate of the various empires which are currently existing and fighting for supremacy. It may not simply be a matter of a return to nations, but simply a matter of competing interests and viabilities for other empires, wherever they may come.
Indeed, yeah. The example of Alexander is an excellent one. You know, certainly insofar as he ended up meeting his end in Babylon, which uh, has a sort of a poetic aspect to it, in the sense of involving himself with these intrigues and agitating his own most important base. or what certainly had been, the key to his success, the Macedonian military structure that really his father deserved a great deal of credit for having built up for him. But there was one thing I wanted to make sure that I got out about Cyrus, because I'm not sure I got it there. The idea of takia was that Cyrus would insert himself into the pantheon. He would not. He simply added himself to the pantheon of the conquered peoples, allowing them to maintain their gods. And so we see a sort of cunning in the imperial project.
Yes, and this is what I was referring back with the concept of the Pontifex Maximus and the concept with the Adin I Ilah, the idea of the imperial cult. All of these facets simply attach the ruling dynasty to the belief structures of the conquered.
Yes, and we see that again with your example, of a figure like Akbar, because I've mentioned this to you before. There's a very distinct thing when you look at the miniatures from that period. You will see the figures at court, and some of them will be wearing the shamshir, the Persian sword. Shamshir meaning something like lion's tail, the deeply bellied and curved saber, and then others will be carrying the katar, or the Hindu punch dagger, as they call it, and you'll see them. You'll see their positions, or their backgrounds, their bases, so to speak, in the court, indicated by how they dress. And I think that's another thing that I wanted to mention. The idea of the different headgear in the Islamic world that you brought up earlier. This was the way in which everything related to sumptuary laws in this respect was how they determined with whom they were dealing. And of course we've had sumptuary laws across history. If any of our listeners don't know about it, they should look into it. I'm quite certain AM knows all about it. But what I wanted to say is that you had this idea of the different headgear with the different social positions. And if you wander around the older parts of Istanbul and look at the graveyards, you will see that the gravestones, headstones is a rather fitting term here, because each of the gravestones will be surmounted by the hat of office and station and position and class of the person buried there. So if you were, to use one of AM's examples, if you were a Yenichedi or a Janissary, you would have Haji Bektaş's sleeve, as your distinctive headgear. If you were a Bektashi dervish of a lower rank, you would have a dört dilimli cap. Or if you were of a higher rank, I think it would be the 12 dilimli, or 4 sections or 12 section cap. And so within that social system, you had that diversity, if you will, reflected visibly by the population in their dress codes. And then to carry this point forward, because this brings together, or echoes some of the themes that we've been talking about, the shift. I believe it's sometime following a good bit after, but certainly following the Tanzimat reforms in the first half of the 19th century, first third, really, I think, if I'm remembering right. You see this idea of the fez coming in, and now you have this imperial headgear that's supposed to show allegiance to this imperial system. They weren't just wearing it in the streets of Istanbul. It wasn't just being worn by Muslims. It would be worn by Alevi and Georgians. Anyone, you could have a such and such pasha from Albania, and he'd be wearing a fez. Of course, in Egypt, they were all wearing fezes. So there was this idea of a leveling, certainly, of how one signified one's status and position. And you see that reflected in this thing with sumptuary laws related to headgear with the Ottoman Empire. But you see the attempt to mark out certain classes with, for example, stars made of yellow wool. We see this time and again. And we can also see how this ideological imposition and an attempt to move between these two poles that seem to be appearing here in our discussion. At the one end, the actual ethnic diversity and national interests, and at the other end, the attempts to impose some sort of monolithic system. These ideological impositions continue to this day, where we see Russia grappling with how to keep themselves together as a quote unquote nation state that is a de facto imperial arrangement. And so people like Dugin come along and peddled their notions of Eurasianism because the time is right for that. So these were just some things that I wanted to throw into the mix. I wanted to ask you, though, AM, um, what would the life and the reason for this question will perhaps become clear later in the conversation. What would the life of a minority within the Austro-Hungarian Empire have been like, and perhaps contrast that if you can with what the life of a minority in Imperial Russia would have been like? And just, for the sake of argument, or to choose an example, could you tell us what the experience of being, let's say, a Jew in Imperial Russia would have been like in the 19th century, and perhaps contrast it with the life of a Jew in the 19th century in the Austro-Hungarian Empire?
I'm trying to juggle in my head various very complicated and far-fetched ideas simultaneously in my head. But just one example, of course, just to bring up the Manchu queue again, because this is, as with the Fez, it is a symbol of dominion. It is a symbol of empire. It is a symbol of subjecthood. It is a symbol of being supplicant to the various authorities that exist. On the one hand, that is the service provided by such dress codes. Yet, of course, the purpose of empire in terms of being able to dominate by nature, it is entropic. It forms more complicated and particular systems over time. And you can say, as a result of that, an elaborate system of hierarchy is necessarily established in terms of the creation of empire. That's not to say that hierarchies don't exist within nations, but you can say that there is a tendency among nations which can't really exist in empires, which is the tendency towards egalitarianism, yet also a tendency towards, you can say, I'm going to use an example. On the one hand, you can say Caesareanism, or you can even say the Führer principle, the idea of the leader as the manifestation of some sort of egalitarian Volk, the idea of Volkism, or the idea of the plebeian masses or the populares rallying behind the figure of Caesar. So you can say, against the incredibly complicated and contradictory nature of the intricate systems of hierarchy associated with empire, nationalism rebels against this through a process of popularism and through a process of simultaneously egalitarianism, yet also the pursuit of uh, folk. Yes, bingo. When I'm thinking of these things, I often mispronounce English many times, but because I'm trying to think of so many things. But anyway, going back to your point, Semiagog, I bring up this in terms of finding a way to segue into your point, because all of these things represent complication. They represent entropy. And such was the case that existed within the Austrian Empire, because the Austrian Empire is a brilliant case study in terms of being able to contrast the ideas of uniform administration and appealing to what is essentially a polyglot empire, yet an empire which isn't really an empire, as I said before. It's rather an assimilation of various states which had come into the Habsburg Empire primarily through a system of inheritance. And that is demonstrated by the status of minorities and what minorities you are talking about in terms of the very specific and particular nature of minority status. So, for example, a Hungarian, especially a Hungarian minor noble, would occupy a much higher position within the empire than, say, for example, a Romanian, Transylvanian serf, which would have existed up until the middle of the 19th century. In the same way that a Ruthenian, later what they would call themselves Ukrainian, would occupy a lower position compared to that of the Poles. You can say that the more active minorities, such as the Germans, such as the Hungarians, and such as the Poles, were able to organize by having a natural ruling class in the form of a extant aristocracy. However, contrasted with that, you say, for example, had the advent of, or the revival of, old and yet new nationalisms. So Pan-Slavism within Austria, originating in Prague, and the idea of a Slavic people who considered themselves subjugated for many centuries, rearing their head again against the idea of German imposing some form of uniformity. This had been a project embarked upon by the Habsburgs since at least the early 17th century, the attempt to create a Urlander, an imperial core, which, despite being primarily German, also incorporates many other ethnicities such as Czech. And the attempt, say, for example, to establish a uniform German administration over polyglot Bohemia and Moravia doesn't go very well. At the same time, you have the ideas of the French Revolution and the idea of national actualization. And so the Austrians have to find increasingly bizarre contrivances to get around this predicament. And so they at one time try and force German officials to speak both German and Czech. And of course, many Czechs are bilingual, but very few Germans are. And so by extension, that policy would actually disenfranchise many, many Germans, which of course had the effect basically of riling up the entire system of imperial administration that had existed up until that point. At the same time, you try and ingratiate these groups by giving them quote unquote representative institutions at a national level. And all this does is create a unworkable system of polyglot peoples shoved into a neoclassical building in Vienna, which is so dysfunctional in terms of its organization, that actually in itself serves as a point of divide and rule. Because none of these nations are obviously in the majority. I mean, German and Hungarian together in the Austro-Hungarian Empire didn't make the majority combined. So this in many ways reinforces the idea of the necessity of rule by the emperor. It is only through the emperor himself, who is the father of all of these nations in the particular, which is able to assimilate and bind all of these organizations together. In fact, the creation of quote unquote representative institutions in many ways makes any alternatives to imperial rule appear farcical because they are demonstrated to be a farce. Farce is incorporated into the constitution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The only exception to this would be in Hungary, where the Magyar nobility have their own agenda and they're pursuing it in contrast to, say, for example, the Habsburg centralism, which is existing in the Austrian part of the empire. So that, again, should demonstrate how the imperial project it can be incredibly clever in terms of contriving all of these ways in terms of being able to justify rule through divide et impera. And in many ways, you can say that you bring up Dugin, for example, there is this idea attached to, you can say, modern Russian foreign policy, which is the idea of third worldism, exploiting the relations of African countries with colonial grievances against Western nations, and then appealing to the migrant populations in Europe as some sort of anti-European bulwark. Well, coming back to the Austrians were very privy and understood this policy, and so they would proactively take measures to prevent such groups arising from without, powers from without to affect politics from within. So, for example, with Serbia, the Austrians were attempting to contrive a preemptive war against Serbia to prevent the Serbs from using the Serb population to carve out parts of the Austrian Empire. In the same way, in Galicia-Lodomeria, the Austrians were able to forestall Russian attempts to influence the region because of the large Ruthenian East Slavic Orthodox population, or rather Uniate population, by appealing to something relatively recent, which is this idea of Ukrainian nationalism. Ukrainian nationalism, which not only negates Russia's claim, but actually acts as a claim vis-a-vis the Russians. And the Austrians' experience from this had been built from the legacy of a series of military disasters in the earlier part of the 19th century, where they had lost their Italian possessions and they had lost basically all of their influence within the rest of Germany. And as a result of that, they had to walk this fine line in terms of being able to manage all of these remnant ethnic cohorts and minorities within the empire. And coming back to Russia and Semigog, I'm trying to make this as detailed as possible. I will eventually come back to your final question, which is on the Jews, because all of this again is related. But coming back to Russia, Russia does not occupy the same position of Austria. Russia was not a conglomeration of nations basically formed around the monarch in terms of inheritance. No. since the 16th and very much the 17th centuries, the Muscovite and later the Russian project is very much that of creating a universal conception, which is, you can say, first of all, built around the idea of the Orthodox Tsar, the Tsar as the protector of Orthodox Christendom, and then belatedly the idea of Russian nationalism. But it's something that the Tsars would not necessarily wholeheartedly embrace, because, like I said, nationalism in and of itself has a tendency towards democracy and egalitarianism, which is in some ways antithetical to rule by confession or rule by dynasty, in this case, the Romanov dynasty. So Russia had a majority Russian. I think it was something like 51% of the population, if we're looking at the borders between 1815 and 1913, with minor exceptions in Bessarabia and the Caucasus, etc. But by and large, the Russians did not rule in the same way the Austrians ruled. Whenever there was a quote unquote constituent kingdom, like, say, for example, Hungary with an Austria that existed within Russia, the Russians would pounce and attempt to eviscerate the process towards decentralization. The most prominent example being the case of Poland. Poland, which was created within Russia with constitutionally guaranteed rights, and then effectively became a occupied territory within the span of 50 years. And whenever the Poles tried to rebel against the Russians will put them down very hard. And with the creation of Germany, the Russians are also looking at their own German populations in the Volga and the Baltic, and they are thinking, we now potentially have a store of fifth columnists who can subvert the territory of Russia in order to augment it to a German empire, which again is more linked to this essence of nationalism, irredenta, appealing to these regions that had once been under German sort of domination or German rule. And so the Russians, again, take active steps in order to negate those influences. And yet at the same time, when you have a place like Finland, which had at one point being aligned to Sweden, the Tsars take a contrary route, which is to appeal to Finnish nationalism as a way of preventing Sweden from basically exerting claims at the expense of Russia. And yet, on the other hand, you have Tsar Alexander II imposing conscription, abolishing serfdom, and promulgating the Ems Ukaz, which suppresses the use of the Ukrainian, or rather the Ruthenian dialect at that time. All of these measures are at the same time a means of mobilizing the Russian people, Russian nationalism, yet all at the same time under this specific context of a confessional, autocratic, dynastic ruler. And I mean autocrat in terms of that even being part of the specific style, the title of the Russian Tsar. Um, so all of these things are very important to consider. Now we finally get to your point about the Jews. Within the Austrian Empire, the Jews occupied something approaching a hierarchical relationship with the Habsburg dynasty itself. Why? Because the Jews themselves did not owe allegiance to any one particular province or kingdom within the empire. And so their position was uniquely predicated on allegiance to the dynasty. In the case of Russia, and again with the Austrians, when we see the advent of German nationalism within the Austrian Empire, on the one hand, it's led by pan-Germanists such as Schonerer, and then you can say the Christian socials under sorry, my brain is going. You have to you have to bear with me. But the Christian socials are pursuing politics which are anti-Jew, because the Jews are associated with dynasticism, and dynasticism is now associated with anti-German feeling. In the many ways, we talk about the majority or the largest ethnic group being destroyed by the process of empire building, which is something I can bring up again. And it's a fundamental point I want to bring home when talking about the Americans, because I think it actually bears very specific consideration here. And I'll bring up other examples. But when we come to the Jews in Russia, because Russia is predominantly a confessional state, and the Jews were far more territorialized than you could possibly assume, Semigog. They occupied something called the Pale of Settlement, but the Pale of Settlement more or less corresponded to the area under the control of the recently annexed Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In other words, they were a a nation inherited through diplomatic contrivance. They were a recent iteration to the Russian Empire, and in many ways they were an aberration. And because they were an aberration, the Russians never successfully found a means of being able to deal with them. And as a result, you have the Russians attempting to manage the relations between Orthodox Christians, Catholic Christians, and the Jewish population. The example in Poland, say, for example, the Austrian managed much better. But at the one time, say, for example, you would have spontaneous outbursts of vilification of the Jews, which come in the form of the pogrom. It should be noted that the Tsars never officially supported the pogrom. Yet at the same time, Tsar Nicholas II would look at things such as Kishinev, and he would see this as a popular demonstration of Russian nationalism. And so even though he wouldn't facilitate the use of the pogrom, he would say that it basically, if anything, rallies support around the idea of nationalism, orthodoxy, and autocracy. I'm butchering the order of that, but again, that being the essence of fealty to the Tsar. And in many ways, you can say that in order to counter this, the Tsars wanted the Jews to be less prominent. They wanted the Jews to assimilate into Russian society. And so we see Alexander III's decrees directed against the use of Jewish naming conventions, and even trying to move Jews out of the cities, trying to de-urbanize the Jews, effectively in order to make their presence less obvious. And you can say on one hand, to make them less of a target, yet on the other hand, to make them less of an organized, cohesive unit. And of course, the effect of this, unlike what we see in Vienna, is that the Jews become radicalized. They become radicalized by the limitations placed on their movement and the prohibitions being placed on their education. Many of them go into exile, and many of them turn to radical forms of socialism and revolutionary anti-Tsarist thinking in general. So when we have the Russian Revolution, we have a remarkable turnabout whereby we see a state which is created in the aftermath of the October 1917 revolution, whereby confessional Tsarism has already been removed at that point, but any sort of remnant of appealing to some sort of orthodox Russian liberal democracy has also been defeated. And now we see a revolutionary cohort, the first Politburo, of whose members, of its first 7 members, 4 of whom were Jewish, and Lenin himself was a quarter Jew. So we come from persecution towards the Jews, which would seem to be in furtherance with the, you can say, more abstract aims of the Russian Tsardom and the encumbrance that the Russian Tsars felt at having inherited the Jewish population. And then we see the revolt of that population ultimately creating the basis of a quote-unquote anti-Russian chauvinist cosmopolitan culture, which is by and large dominated by Jews.
Yes, I think perhaps you may be headed in the same direction I am. Because and the reason I ask this question is because we certainly see an overrepresentation in groups agitating for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And to me, it's very, very interesting to think about this later wave of Jews who arrived in the United States. Of course, the U.S. from very early on had, I believe, primarily Sephardic Jews who were there since prior to the founding of the United States. But of course, after this period of revolutions sweeping Europe, leaving aside all that went on with Napoleon, just starting with, for example, 1848, and figures like Marx and Engels.
Well, to come on to your point in particular, because this fits into the Russian picture in terms of the revolution in the 20s before the Stalinist subversion, is the idea of diversity, equity, inclusion being the implicit assumption of the building of world socialism. So within the context of the Soviet Union, we see a pursuit of a quote-unquote cosmopolitan culture, a cosmopolitan culture which is going to diversify through a process of laying down roots and creating autonomous republics as part of the project to build world socialism. So we are diversifying the provinces, and yet at the same time we are trying to integrate those provinces into a cosmopolitan culture, which is supposed to be the vehicle for the expansion of world socialism. And we are going to make these places uniformly equal as part and extension of the utopianism, which is the explicit stated policy of the creation of socialism, which is to be followed by the withering away of the state and the advent of utopian communism. So diversity, equity, and inclusion was the essence of the overall project, at least in its early days. What Stalin realizes is that many of his opponents represent this Jewish majority. I mean, take for example the first Politburo, Trotsky, Kamenev, Zinoviev, all Jews. They are also the principal obstacles to his power. Stalin at once appeals to this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion implicit in the construction of world socialism, and subverts it, the quote unquote, what he originally railed against as the great Russian chauvinism, by appealing to socialism in one country. And this is the idea, the universal idea, you can say the imperialistic idea of world socialism, world government, workers the world unite, being confronted with the realities of the empire as it exists, which is essentially a truncated version of the Russian Empire under the Tsars. Indeed, a truncated version which actually has as a percentage a larger Russian core than that of the Russian Empire which preceded it. And so you can say by imperialist necessity, in order to manage these disparate regions, which are not equal in terms of population, Russia is overwhelmingly dominant within this union. The logic is to put aside this pursuit of diversity, equity, and inclusion, at least de facto, and return to a form of what the socialists would call the Great Russian Chauvinism. And of course, many people who are pursuing the Marxist project and many Jews looking at the situation of Russia saw this not only as a form of ideological betrayal, but they also saw this as a form of ethnic betrayal. And this also talks to the point that all of these organizations, these implicit universalist assumptions, they don't have to be linked exclusively to the Soviet project. So say, for example, looking, you can say at the facets of the growth of these ideas. On the one hand, you see the growth of global financial institutions, mainly in the 16th century, which take off and then become latched on to the Dutch and the British imperial projects. And then in the case of left-wing activism, we see that with the 19th century, primarily in continental Europe, with the Dreyfus Affair in France, with the rise of the Democratic Socialist Party in Germany, and with the ascendancy of the Bolsheviks following the Russian Revolution. So you have all of these distinct conceptions of essentially what it means to be assimilated as part of this universalized sort of imperialist project. And I do mean sort of imperialist in a very contemporary sense in terms of what empires look like today, as opposed to what empires looked like before the First World War, whereby they are linked by institutions, they are linked by finance and regimes based on debt, and they are linked by post-Christian ideology. In this case, various iterations of leftism, or whatever you want to call it, woke, whatever. The origins of all this, as far as I'm concerned, are in the 18th and the 19th century, and you can see what is going on today simply as an extension of these processes that had begun all that time ago. In the case of the Soviet Union failed to live up to the promises which many utopian leftists and socialists trying to create the one world government looked to. And so they spurned it. And an attempt to legitimately reform it to reflect those values under Gorbachev, if anything, just simply accelerated the demise of the empire and tagging the interests of all of these various groups and institutions to NATO and to seeing Russia being integrated into NATO as part of this post-Cold War unipolar society, all of these things. But all of this, again, is indicative in terms of the relationship between empires and nationalism. This is antithetical to nationalism wherever it appear. In Russia, it appeared as antithetical to nationalism until Stalin's stint as the Red Tsar. And before I get into America, I want to bring in a few examples. I mean, I mentioned Alexander. With the case of Persia, it was less obvious, but I mentioned the case of Alexander because Alexander, in my view, destroyed the Greek nation by creating his empire, at least in the long term. Another example to bring up is that of the Mongols. The Mongols conquered the largest continuous world empire in history. They established themselves as a military aristocracy famed for their superlative command of large-scale logistics, being able to field divisions of 10,000, 100,000 horse units, basically across the entire span of what we would basically see as Central Asia, forging campaigns in China and being able to launch campaigns into Hungary and Poland. Really remarkable considering we're talking about the 13th century here. So what begins as an empire, which is predicated on the idea of conquest, in terms of being able to manage these distant sort of regions, whether it be the Ilkhanate in Iran, whether it be the Golden Horde in southern Russia, or whether it be the Yuan dynasty in China, or indeed the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, all of these groups have to make compromises to the local organizations in which they essentially find themselves dominant over. And as a result, the process of empire building destroys Mongolia as a concept. The Mongolian traditions of nomadism and the original military genius, which inspired the creation of the empire, are essentially extinguished within the span of 100 years. There are attempts, as you say, with Din-i-La, with Cyrus, with the Pontifex Maximus, to create Genghis Khan as the equivalent deity to be inserted into the various belief structures. But ultimately, the belief structures of the local people assert themselves more strongly than the idea of the Mongols' ability to assimilate these cultures. And so, first of all, the empires divide and then they collapse. And what is left of Mongolia is ultimately going to be dominated by other groups, whether it be the Ming and later by the Qing dynasty, which is dominated by another ethnic group called the Manchus. I bring this up because I believe that is what happened in the case of America. I think it's really quite evident to see that in the case of America, this is something I looked into a large part of last year in terms of being able to understand. But America essentially existed in the first sort of 100 years of its history, the antebellum America, as a conglomeration, a union of white ethnostates, white sovereign states. And by the process of the 19th century, that identity of America had basically been destroyed, and American identity, which is predicated on race and even predicated on territory, was no longer the case, as America accepted immigration from Ireland, from Germany, from Italy, and indeed from Russia, and in particular the Jewish population. So all of a sudden, America, especially as it expands during the First World War and rapidly during the Second World War with the collapse of the older empires such as Britain, becomes uniquely placed, having already, say, for example, weakened the core component, which is, say, for example, American WASP nationalism or American isolationism. It has jettisoned that in terms of pursuing a global imperial project, and implicit in that is many of the assumptions which were predicated around the early hopes of creating developed world socialism in the Soviet Union, which is connecting all of these various power blocks, whether it be the European Union, the remnants, the British Empire, the Five Eyes, pegged to the American imperial project. And like we see with the Politburo in the Soviet Union, the first Politburo, which was overwhelmingly Jewish, in the case of America, we see today with figures such as Chuck Schumer, etc., the Secretary of Homeland Security, and Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, and many other examples I could bring. It seems that America has actually found itself in a very similar situation, albeit unlike in the Soviet Union in the early 1920s, America has reached its territorial zenith while having essentially found itself in a situation where it mirrors the characteristics of the early Soviet Union.
Yeah, it's very interesting indeed. One of the aspects of this that I was, chewing on myself was this idea that this later wave of Jewish immigration, which carried with it any number of motivated individuals who embraced utopian ideals. Much of it came from what was formerly Russia, and also a number of domains. I always feel strange when I say Austro-Hungarian Empire. I feel like I'm referring to it by something that's inaccurate, but surely you know what I mean when I say it. I think it
No,
should be called.
the Austro-Hungarian Empire is the official name from 1867 onwards to 1980. I mean, it is there are of course qualifications to add to that, but you're basically correct in saying Austro-Hungarian Empire.
When I'm speaking to you, I feel that I should call it the Holy Roman Empire, but
Oh,
yes.
no, no, no, no. The Holy Roman Empire have been gone since 1806. Don't worry.
Okay. Well, the main thing is that we have these populations that arrive full of these notions that they begin to quite assiduously um, um, plant the seeds for, and engage in a variety of projects to bring to fruition in the United States. I think about that, and I think about this entire background of how Jews within these various empires would have would have been swimming within um, sets of assumptions about what is best for them that they carried from each of these circumstances, whether it be the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian. Um, in in each of these cases, we see variations on this tension between um, some sort of territorialization and something, approximating nationalism at one end, and at the other end, this desire to impose a uniformity, and the fight to balance these tensions. They arrived in a place, the United States, at the time when they were coming here, even following the war between the states. It was still a very, very different place up until somewhere in the neighborhood of World War One, and a bit earlier. It was a very, very different place than anywhere they had been before. And so the reason I asked earlier about, what would the experience of a Jew in one of these empires have been, in their day-to-day life, what kind of circumstances would they confront? I was trying to tease out this notion that they arrived in this place that when they first got there had very little to do, really, I think, unless I'm mistaken, very little to do really with the circumstances that they had lived under and developed their thinking under and their
I think
behaviors under.
America had a remarkable situation. I mean, first of all, as with sort of Britain, as with the Netherlands, as with America, I mean, Jews were a component of that, but they weren't in the position that they are today. I think the reason Jews in America found themselves in the position where they could accelerate and indeed become part of the ruling coalition, and you can say the Imperial coalition, is by a nature the desire of the Democratic Party to become the natural party of government in the United States, because the Democrats had originally been the party of Andrew Jackson. They had been, you can say, the core of quote unquote budding American nationalism in the 1820s and the 1830s, as America is transitioning away, say, for example, of the rule of the founders' oligarchy into that of a partisan political system. However, as a result of the Civil War, the Democrats have basically had to reformulate their appeal in order to obtain power vis-a-vis the Republicans. In the South, they still appeal to these ideas, you can say, of white nationalism and originalism. But in the North, they appealed to a broad coalition which incorporated Italians, the Irish, and indeed the Jews. So already the Democratic Party by the 1880s and the 1890s, and going up until really the 1960s, was, for all intents and purposes, it had the appearance of some sort of imperial ruling bloc, an imperial confederation built around the idea of diversity, which is becoming more endemic in terms of the United States. And in response to that, you can say that it shouldn't really come as a surprise that the final transition for the Democratic Party in the 1960s was for a Southern white Lyndon B. Johnson to go out of his way to betray his constituents, to formally integrate all of the quote unquote peripheral populations of the United States, the anti WASPs, into a bona fide imperial confederation, which essentially they have led, I believe, the political tempo in the United States since the 1960s, and the Republicans have basically been fellow travelers in that system. But I believe if you look to the 1880s, there is a very sort of clear trajectory. And why I particularly find the Democratic Party rather fascinating in this, probably more so than any other equivalent European party, which you can say has been latched on to this quote unquote multicultural agenda. It really does seem to be an extension of what the Democratic Party had established in the late 19th and early 20th century.
Very good. Yes, I believe there's quite a bit to how these various empires have attempted to manage these tensions and what we're confronting today. Again, to come back to some things that I mentioned at the beginning of this stream, everything that I see in the United States now, when they talk about the community or this community or that community, it reflects the tension between these warring deterritorialized groups, and absent a territory of their own, they attempt to seize it. You can look at very early examples, like the Mormons heading out and trying to basically make a state for themselves. You can look at Irish and Italian gangs fighting each other in New York neighborhoods. I've done a considerable study of the distribution of graffiti in different neighborhoods and how it indicates territorial boundaries. But in they can attempt to establish them to a certain extent, whether it's at the level of a state. Once upon a time, Maryland being a sort of outlier, sort of more Catholic state in the United States. Utah, I already mentioned. You've got Germans that settled villages in Texas. These kinds of things. But in the absence of real, more meaningful territorialization, if you will, you see the emergence of the equivalent of sumptuary laws, these kinds of expressions where you're deprived of the territory, and so you have to make statements about what you quote unquote identify with based on your appearance. So to me, the blue hair or the scars on your chest where breasts used to be increasingly seem to me to have to do with the different hats worn by Muslim classes, or indicating allegiance to the larger imperial project by wearing the fez. Identity is something that it seems to me that we've been taught to say now instead of nation, because when we talk about this community or that community, we've again come back to this deterritorialized system, and the idea of the state allowing a certain amount of power to be wielded in certain affairs by these respective communities, because there is nothing that would otherwise bind people together. So now people talk about preserving their identity instead of their nations, and this seems to me a sign of further deterritorialization. It's you are nowhere, and someone had mentioned earlier in the chat, that empires are always liberal, and I tend to disagree very much. I think that we've with AM's help, I've at least begun
Well,
this.
I mean, in fairness, it depends how you're defining liberal. I almost never use the word liberal because it's one of the most elusive terms in terms of trying to find some sort of definition. I mean, I can go back to the etymology and I can go back to the history in terms of using it as a political label. Maybe liberal here is almost being used as some sort of byword for Democratic Party politics.
Yes, I think perhaps the person in the chat was referring to the idea that people are given more leeway in their behavior, more room for self-expression. I'm not entirely sure, but the idea is it does not seem to me that you can frame it in this way. What I was starting to say is, with your help, I think I see now this continuum with these sort of poles, if you will. And this is just, for purposes of discussion and consideration. I'm not trying to reify anything as being absolutely true. Um, but but there's a tension that has to be managed, and it's between um the actual need for defensible borders of some kind when it comes to a nation, because wars happen. And if you happen to be parked in the middle of the trans-European plain like Poland is, they're going to be very real um things that come out of that. On the other hand, there has to be some degree of uniformity, some degree of imposition of shared standards. Um, uh, and it seems to be that the balancing of this is central to all of these empires and their efforts to continue to exist and to exercise power. Um, it, so I guess a good question at this point, unless there's something else important that was missed that you want to bring up, of course, in which case I invite you to do so. What does history tell us about what's likely to happen to uh, to all of us at this time, given that we're seeing the entire world turn into a patchwork of competing interests, where they talk about identity, and where presumably you would see, whether it be like Stalin coming in and saying, well, this has gone a little bit too far, or a thing that I very often bring up. Everyone talks about this sort of one world arrangement, except we have to face the reality of the military industrial complex, or complexes, and the fact that they're predicated on at least the existence of one enemy in order to justify their continuing money making machine, at the making of money at a scale that's staggering. Um, so, we need enemies, we need defensible borders in order for that to continue to exist. We also need secrets where there's, the idea of an arms race. The military industrial complex can't do what it does unless it holds out the threat of this other group coming up with something even better. And that requires that you really do defend certain secrets and certain manufacturing capacities. And we're seeing a lot of that underscored with what is now going on in Ukraine. So we could see this, the idea of the one world project, but we see this fundamental idea of the specter of conflict and competitors as necessary for some of the most deeply seated power structures to continue to exist. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, we see again this sort of these poles and the management of these conflicting forces. What do you see happening to us today? What would you imagine might be coming in the near future?
I think that that question really forms a bit of an epilogue for the stream. But just you mentioned you're inviting me to add a couple more points before I do so, because I do want to answer that question. But like I said, I think that's the natural sort of end point for the stream, and there are 2 points really to consider in terms of the modern day. Because I've talked about dynasty, I've talked about confession, but in terms of today, I really think it's important in terms of being able to understand migration and democracy, and these 2 ideas in tandem, and what they mean, and what the evolving definitions are, and what the subversion of these principles are. Because take migration, on the one hand, the most obvious example is Jewish migration, being a diaspora really since the first century AD. But perhaps another example actually to bring is something which has been touted ad nauseum as a justification of what's going on today, which is economic migration. On the one hand, Jews represent this in terms of being able to be usurers, which is quite useful in terms of a Christian society which cannot themselves use usury, and then can be penalized and expelled, such as happened in France and Britain, if the situation necessitates it. But the alternative to that is actually looking at German migration. German migrants throughout 13th century, during something called the Aussiedlung, the Eastern settling, were invited into the kingdoms of Hungary, were invited into Poland, and as a result of that, they formed major urban. They became a distinct class, which in Germany is Bürgerliche, which means essentially the town dwellers, coming from the German the Burg, which essentially means the steading of the town, the city. From that, we see the creation of urban centers. So the idea of migration, economic migration, being set up as this idea of urbanization in particular. In terms of being able to judge this, another aspect of this in terms of empire building is the loyalty afforded to newcomers, not people who have been conquered, like in the Ottoman example, but people who have willingly decided to subjugate themselves to another power. In the case of the Germans, you can say it was actually a remarkably successful project. In the case of Transylvania, which was then part of Hungary, you actually had a system of German knights being able to come over and create a system of, if I remember correctly, Stuhl, essentially castle fortifications, uh, throughout the system of Transylvania, and indeed the idea of importing Saxon economic migrants and Saxon knights goes into as far as places as the Balkans and indeed Serbia. Originally, these people would actually owe allegiance to their local kings and to the King of Poland, but by the 19th century, these groups were beginning to exert a powerful friction in terms of the national makeup of these various empires to which they belonged. Now we're talking about Austria-Hungary within the context of Austro-Hungarian nationalism, and with the Russian Empire. I bring this up because all of a sudden, these groups have essentially become the potential projects or the useful assets of foreign powers. In the case of Germany, it is this Aussiedlung, this economic migration, this thing which many powers took on essentially in order to create vertical relationships and to create the process of urbanization in these towns in Eastern Europe. These communities formed the basis of the creation of German irredentism, which really came to the fore in terms of the 1930s and the foreign policy of the National Socialist Party, which was predicated around uniting all of these groups into a single Reich, which was predicated on, again, it's a imperialist project. At the same time, it is also a fundamentally nationalistic project. It is construing expansionism, not in terms of universalism, but in terms of being able to unite a particular folk, a nation, which is predicated around race, which is something that was rather foreign to many Germans who, say, for example, have lived in Hungary or Poland for half a millennia at that point, distinct from any form of German identity. So we're seeing economic migration and then the use of foreign powers, in particular, being able to subvert that process and use that as a casus belli. The reason I bring up is because essentially the policy of Western nations accelerated since 2015 in the quote unquote Syrian refugee crisis has been this policy gone beyond all sort of restraint and reason to preposterous degrees. And I think that's really fair saying that in terms of the volume of what we're seeing, because this feeds into another aspect which you can say fundamentally subverts the idea of nationalism, the nation state, and quote unquote democracy in terms of associated with the idea of economic migration or refugees, which is the idea of the vote. When you look at, say, for example, democratic Athens, something that Plato and other commenters would note is that the pure democracy actually became a very imperialistic project towards the end of it. In other terms, giving all the citizens a vote. In the same way as politics in Europe was predicated around participatory politics in terms of affording the vote to more and more people. I believe something that is absolutely core, essential in terms of being able to conceive of democracy, quote unquote, representational politics within the scheme of nationalism is the idea of the voter being a stakeholder, i.e., the voter has to be propertied, and the voter has to represent some sort of microcosm of the nation writ large. In other words, say, for example, the head of a household which in many ways represents one of many subsets, which represents the overall clan, which is that of the nation. the minute you take that concept and you begin to apply it to everyone, regardless of property restrictions, and then to women, which fundamentally breaks the idea of the hierarchical structure, the patriarchy rooted in the family, there is now a incentive to continually expand the franchise in order to essentially form new power blocks to create a new system of governments, which has gone beyond that of the nation state. I've already brought this up with the Democratic Party, I would say being the most obvious and the most effective example in terms of being able to understand this today. But this was a process writ large, which has now occurred throughout all of Europe. And with the United States, I believe a senator today actually said that our policy for the last 30 years has been to prioritize undocumented migrants and to essentially give them money and fast track them into becoming the new democratic votes of the future. So what we're seeing is the idea of quote unquote democracy derived from the French Revolution being an essential component of nationalism, which is now being deracinated. And the broader the electorate has become, when the electorate no longer has a vested interest or a stake in the nation and represents a microcosm of that nation, once the voter can be anyone and you extend the voting population to include essentially anyone in the world post borders, then all of a sudden democracy becomes a vehicle for rampant universalist imperialism. And that is what we've been seeing in the United States. The justification for this is economic migration. But in contrast to what we saw with German migration during the Aussiedlung, is that these people are not bringing any, I think this is fair to say, the economic benefits associated with the immigration is become more abstract by the day in terms of the actual specific benefits that all migrants from all backgrounds, as opposed to a specific group like the Germans in the 13th century or the Huguenots in the 17th century, various people in terms of defense of this sort of immigration will point to these examples despite the fact that they bear almost no resemblance whatsoever. We're talking about ethnic, you can say, whites and Slavs, French and Prussians, co-religionists in the sense of French Calvinists and the King of Prussia. And then we're talking about anyone of any creed from anywhere with nebulous economic utility, which is now being imported. All of a sudden, democracy has become pure imperialism. It has become pure universalism. And so that is where, quote unquote, democratic politics, the expansion of the franchise, the entire logic is about building a new imperial coalition. It is about erasing borders. And as the coalition behind democratic politics, quote unquote, the voter, becomes larger, the imperial class at the top becomes more consolidated. And bringing this back to the Austrian Empire, as Austrian representational politics became more farcical, as it became more dysfunctional, as it became more polyglot, the emperor became more essential to the entire system. In other words, the actual managerial sort of process of the empire was elevated while the electoral process was trivialized by becoming accessible to everyone, to the point that any sort of consideration of real democracy rooted in ethnos, rooted in demos, became preposterous to consider. I say all this because this is the situation where we find ourselves, and this will inform the entire sort of process going forward in terms of all of these various facets building into the current imperialist project. Someone is saying bean counter mentality. Well, you can say there are many justifications for this. One is a bean counter mentality, but I think the whole idea of line go up has now become pure fantasy. I don't believe that's borne out by anything. Populations are increasing, but prices are going up. Houses are becoming unaffordable. Wages are going down. And like I said, all of this is doing, like the case in the Austrians, is making the groups in power more distant, more imperial, more universal, more deracinated. So when we come to today, what are we seeing in Russia? What are we seeing in China, which represent the counters to this? The Soviet Union collapsed because it was appealing to a romantic utopian universalism. Gorbachev did not believe in Russian nationalism. He was a true believer in the utopian socialist project. If anything, Gorbachev was one trying to realize the promise of Lenin in 1917 to give all power to the Soviets, all powers to the Workers' Council, not all power to the Russians, but all powers to the workers of the world. So when it comes to Russia today, we are, or rather Russia, is having to deal with that legacy of having resulted essentially the Russian Imperial project being attached to this deracinated universalist project of world socialism. Under Putin, the project has now become more similar to, say, for example, that of Slobodan Milosevic or Franjo Tuđman in the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s, whereby you have revanche, you have irredentism, you have all of these expat groups in Ukraine, in Kazakhstan, in the Baltic republics, who, if anything, feel more of a connection to Russia, especially in Ukraine, than they do to the recently independent states created in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union. And I've been told, people are pinging me on Twitter and saying that Putin is currently going into a lengthy exposition about Russian history. People are even saying that he's doing an AM. And the reason I bring this up is because Putin is appealing to Russian nationalism. He is not appealing to utopian socialism. He is not appealing to universalism. He is talking about territorialization. He's talking about natural borders. He's talking about national defense. All of these things, which are, you can say, antithetical to the universalist, quote unquote, subverted democratic project that we are seeing in the West today. And thereby, by an extension, Russia is becoming most assuredly an antithesis to all of this. Yet at the same time, there isn't some sort of ideological imperative coming from Russia to support, say, for example, universal Christendom, or an imperative to support the white race, whatever you define that as. Rather, Putin is coming from the legacy of the Soviet foreign policy of the 1960s and 70s, which is that of third worldism, which is that of subverting the Americans by focusing on policies which are anti-containment, supporting the Vietnamese, supporting the Ethiopians. And so the project of universalism, which is baked into migration as a policy in order to buttress the imperial universalism, which is now encountering the West, is actually being used by Putin to on the one hand, to buttress Russian nationalism by fomenting dissident movements all across the West, turning these migrant populations, as we have seen throughout all of history, into potential fifth colonists through which to wreak havoc and destabilize these states. And of course, such is natural when you have created so many Mio, when you've created so many nations within nations with their own vested interests and no tangible connection to one another. And interestingly, when we're talking about the crisis in military recruitment, no loyalty. No loyalty from these particular groups to the states that they inhabit, but no loyalty now from the majority populations to the groups they have. In all ways, therefore, Russia, as representing an antithesis to this, can benefit from this. And in order to subvert it, it has to embody many aspects of, say, for example, foreign policy, geopolitical dexterity, in terms of being able to harness all of these forces which seem contradictory, but ultimately are in the service, as far as Putin is concerned, in terms of preserving a civilizational Russian state. Civilizational because he doesn't necessarily have an ethnic conception of what it means to be Russian, given the polyglot and multinational essence of what Russia is today, but very much Russian nationalism as existed, say, for example, throughout the 17th century up until the 20th century. And I think China is another example of that, because China was communist, or really, it calls itself communist today, but it's really, you can say, state socialism would be a better way of referring to it. Socialism with Chinese characteristics, which you can say is probably more similar to Prussian socialism, that is the developed socialism of as the prelude to communism in Marxist thought. All of these things indicate that we are moving beyond Maoism. We are moving beyond universalism in China as well. At the one hand, you have to remember in the 1960s and 70s, Mao was attempting to present himself as the doctrinaire, anti-revisionist communist in terms of being able to subvert the global communist movement and take that mantle away from the Soviet Union. Now this is no longer really a factor in Chinese politics. When China is spying on various powers in the West, when China is getting involved in industrial and economic espionage, when China is basically infiltrating the universities, they are not doing so with the intention of expanding world communism. They are doing so with the exception of essentially weakening and subverting politicians and various states in the West. And so, by extension, China is now following in that mold which Russia has set up, which is this idea of civilizational preservationism and the defense of a very specific set of borders and creating a territorial buffer zone surrounding that. Say, for example, that would include, I don't know, Indochina, the South China Sea around the Philippines, appealing to nationalism in Taiwan, and also looking at sort of intermediary states such as North Korea as a counterweight to what's going on in South Korea. So in terms of, you can say, the logic of what's going on at the moment, as we are receding from a unipolar world, the United States has become more entrenched and more sort of aligned with the interests of these deracinated institutions, which I brought up at the beginning, whilst Russia and China are becoming more consolidated around a more recognizable concept of empire rooted in civilization and attached to some sort of broader, grandiose conception of the original nation state. And so, in terms of how I see this going, really, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, this is a psychological question because history would tell us, Semiagog, that many countries in the West would revolt against this, that many countries would essentially adopt a form of Caesarean politics. But I don't really see that manifesting in a way that would justify a response to what's going on. And really, I think that's sort of going beyond the parameters of this conversation on imperial diversity in terms of being able to unlock the particular sort of psychological malaise. I mean, in Britain, I mean, it's so far advanced that there is no such thing, say, for example, as the right. There is no such thing as a national advocacy group which has any influence or power whatsoever. So that really is an uncharted territory, and perhaps things will have to accelerate and become much worse before we see any sort of psychological shift.
Yes. And therein lies, yeah, all those things that come pouring out of Pandora's jar, her pathos, and the last of those horrors is of course hope. Who knows what will come next? The only thing I would add before um, wrapping up, because I think that's an excellent summation, is that the nature of what you just outlined that's going on in China and in Russia in terms of the assertion of these policies across the world, in some respects, as a counterbalance to what's happening in the United States, or uh, in the United States and emanating from it to the various places, it bullies about and applies its pressure to. Um, the very idea that the Russians and the Chinese, in their various ways, would use nationalism or the appearance of nationalism, fomenting it in the third world, for example, as was the case with Russia that you mentioned. Um, we see that, for example, with what's going on now in Niger. I believe we're going to see more of it coming out with what's going on in Sudan. We may, in fact, see some aspects of this come to life in South Africa. Um, at any rate, it raises the question of the degree to which it would serve Chinese and Russian interests to foment these nationalist or superficially nationalist or seemingly nationalist reactions in the West. Um, to what extent would that be desirable for the Chinese and the Russians? So you have this odd situation where many of the elites in the West would want to say, oh, it's the Russians who are fomenting these reactions, and the Russians back Trump. Or farmers' protests actually have this attempted destabilization by Putin, and it's
Well, I mean, there is a corollary to that where they are correct, but that assumes that um, Putin is on the offensive, when in reality, I believe Putin is very much on the defensive. and he is responding to imperial overreach. Say, for example, we bring up the case in Niger. One of the reasons why these, not only we talk about economic penetration and the fact that China in particular is in need of the economic development of areas such as the Congo and places which have vast mineral wealth. But say, for example, the desire to impose uniform diversity, equity, and inclusion politics in Uganda. Being a sort of prime example, when these policies are introduced, and what is it, Ron DeSantis saying we need to intervene to ensure effective policies against against anti-Semitism in Africa. All this does is push these powers away from the harmonizing and sort of centralizing attempts of the empire, and allow them to drift more as a result of sort of mutual advantage into the orbit of Russia. I don't necessarily believe that Russia has any sort of grander ideological imperative here. But when it comes back to, say, for example, you can say the strategic self-defeating arguments in the West, which I don't believe need any Russian support, is that the more you increase the constituency of the voters, the more deracinated the leaders become from the population, the more you negate the idea of belonging itself. Now they are facing a fundamental crisis which they have been too late to really grapple with, which is the crisis of recruitment. No one in the West is really prepared to fight and die for what they are essentially see as a imperialist project in Ukraine, because they understand that they are not doing it essentially in terms of their own national self-interest, let alone their own self-interest. And Putin doesn't really need to do anything in order to foment that. It is the policies which have been employed in the West, which have already created the situation, the self-own effectively, where that situation has been able to essentially weaken, if not paralyze, the potential of the West to really confront a more militarized, more nationalistic revivalism in the case of Russia. Indeed, my theory regarding that is the only way in terms of being able to militarily sustain the empire is through the use of mercenary organizations, essentially paid, deracinated militias who can come from anywhere. Because I believe many nations in the 19th century focused on nationalism by way of facilitating conscription. In France had been defeated in 1870 and 1871 by Prussia. And so French nationalism, rather simply, was we will return these territories, Alsace and Lorraine. We will embody this pursuit of revanche, and we will nationalize the French nation in order to achieve these nationalistic aims. Our current governments, or rather regimes, cannot offer anything like that so simple and so motivating. And as a result, these policies seem to be entirely self-defeating. And so I think we're going to see, as we're already seeing in Ukraine, which is the proliferation of mercenary warfare being directed against a mobilized national force, which is coming out of Russia.
Yes, and I certainly did not mean to suggest that Russia or China had an ideological commitment to support, if indeed they do support any of these counter movements in the
Well,
West.
there are who certainly do. I mean, Dugan is a good example. I mean, he has sort of voiced his support of people such as Ibram Kendi, and some sort of bizarre theories in terms of uh, black supremacism based on melanin and things like that. So that there is definitely an aspect of that which is rooted in a Eurasianism, which is essentially funded on anti-European hate. I will have to emphasize that does exist, but I don't believe Putin really pays attention to these theories and is basically more willing to pursue objectives based on realist aims regarding Russia's self-interest, rather than grand ideological schemes which are basically predicated on some sort of justified revolt of the third world in terms of being able to negate the significance of European civilization, which is definitely an ideological component for these people.
Yes, I think Duganism is to whatever extent there is any reality to it. I think it's primarily a tool to agitate one side, while at the same time it's very much to China's and Russia's advantage to agitate the other side, because, as you say, it's an own goal. It's a self-own that we're engaged in here, and so it actually suits their interests, I think, to push more of exactly what we've been doing, um, and at the same time to perhaps also do things to raise the profile and the reach of people who seem to be talking about, more traditional nationalistic aspects. Like one of the ones that I've noted and mentioned in the past is many things that appear to be outreach that I see in the world of memes and the rest, and on social media, where the Russians are attempting to reach out to American Southern whites. Um, so I think that on the one hand, there probably is quite a bit of Chinese and Russian sub rosa support for traditionalism, nationalism, reactionary elements, and the rest.
And
But
there's also Russian support for migrant groups, NGOs, Green Party
yes, absolutely,
politics.
because it serves as you laid it out earlier, and I think quite rightly. They can sit back and allow the dialectical pushback to crystallize around them the further that the madmen in the West, well, I shouldn't call them madmen because that's giving them a break. They know what they're doing, but mad in the sense that they would imagine that it has any future. They certainly can sit back and allow the reaction to crystallize around what's been done and what's being done by a figure like Biden, and his handlers, which is one of the reasons that I tend to think, looking at what Biden has done. Now I'm going far afield, but just a last thought, looking at what Biden has done in this period of his administration, I think it's fair to say that it has led to the most dramatic improvement in China's situation that we have seen for quite some time. It's driven Russia and China. Otherwise, they would be competing hegemons in the same Eurasian landmass. It's driven them into each other's arms. It's opened up Iran, that Russia formerly kept at something of a distance. As you well know, Iran and Russia were historically competitors. So I tend to think that there is a lot of Chinese support, direct support, and manipulation going on behind what Biden is doing. Probably quite a bit less in terms of Russian support for that. But yes, the only thing to underscore there is that I think it's in both China and Russia's interests to, on the one hand, agitate for us to keep doing what we're doing, and even more ridiculously in many respects. On the other hand, it does serve their ends to devote some portion of their attention to raising up the profile of reactionary elements, just based on the idea that it sows a kind of chaos and political instability within, certainly in the United States, places like Britain as well. Though, of course, as you mentioned, it's hard to say that there's even anything like a right left in Britain.
Well, I mean, just a final sort of comment, as it were, to end my participation in this. I brought up the Moguls earlier as to represent, you can say, the superlative examples of imperial management, imperial diversity, being able to integrate all of these seemingly uh, antithetical groups together into a cohesive whole, united around a foreigner with a foreign religion, which is really quite remarkable. Yet at the same time, how when that relationship was essentially thwarted, when the empire began to make mistakes, how almost instantly the empire collapsed. To me, there are parallels and with what is going on today in that. I don't want to make any bold predictions because I think the logic of what is going on should necessitate a Mogul type collapse. And yet, for some bizarre, inconceivable reason, which I'm going to place on something more akin to pathos, things continue to go on, and the decline and civilizational collapse continues unabated. Because you brought up Iran, for example. Iran was one of the imperial success stories. The British were able to prevent the Russians expanding through Iran into the Persian Gulf. The British and the Americans were then able to prevent Iran falling into the Soviet camp, first in the 1940s and then after the nationalist Iranian coup in the 1950s. However, having built up Iran, the Iranian Shah then began to subvert the West through the integration into OPEC. And then by the end of the 1970s, a regime appeared which was essentially predicated on hostility to these nations, which had originally buttressed it against the Soviet Union. Now we have reached the logical conclusion of that, whereby Iran has been driven into the arms of the Soviet Union, while Iran itself is pursuing aims which are quite similar to that of China and that of Russia, albeit you can say confessional and ethnic related uh, adventures in Lebanon, in Syria, and Iraq, and all of this again is at the expense of the Americans. And going back to my Mughal situation, part of the reason which accounts for the Mughal decline is the idea essentially of imperial contradiction. Akbar had been able to assimilate seemingly contradictory forces predicated around the idea of the deification of the leader of the dynasty, and that in itself relied on not getting too involved in terms of the micromanagement of these various dependent groups or on the imposition of one ideology at the expense of another. However, with the pursuit of Islam in particular, and you can say rampant corruption, which again is another theme going on today, the illegitimacy around the system and the ideological contradictions in the empire began to become apparent until they were indefensible. What is going on today is something very similar in terms of rampant corruption and ideological contradiction, supreme ideological contradiction. Even the use of democracy doesn't make any sense. Democracy means suppressing elections. Democracy means fortifying elections. Democracy involves importing people to outvote the people who are already here. Democracy could be anything, but really what democracy uses is just a byword for power, and power at all expense. And people are noticing this. It's blatantly obvious now. Another way that this subversion of democracy can be manifest is the idea that all imperial systems, which we've been mentioning, tend towards entropy. They tend towards very complicated and contradictory systems of hierarchy based on the patronage of certain groups. That is becoming more and more evident when it comes to the destruction of any idea which is founded on the rule of law applying equally to all, which again is an idea coming out manifest in the idea of the French Revolution, the nationalist revolution, you can say, against the regimes of Europe and indeed against the French monarchy in and of itself. As all of these contradictions again appear, are made manifest, are resulting in all of the things we're talking about, economic stagnation, imperial overstretch, a recruitment crisis. Theoretically, it should lead to a situation like the Moguls, where there is no ideological legitimation and there is no will to preserve the regime. I think what differentiates, however, the Moguls from the situation we're facing is that even though there is no groundswell of support, there does seem to be a commitment, an ideological drive among the elites to continue the system. And maybe that's finally beginning to ebb with the 2024 election, I don't know. But it's something, again, I would contrast with the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, there was a fundamental lack of will to preserve the Warsaw Pact and to retain the Soviet Union. It was something that became obvious in the 1970s and simply accelerated throughout the 1980s. So that is the one thing I can't mention, again, appealing to one aspect, which is pathos, and another, which is the will to hold on to power. And these are the two variables I can't really account for. But laying out all of these other facets regarding the nature of imperialism and diversity, it ought to tend to a Mogul type situation, but we'll see how events transpire.
Indeed, we will. And it seems that we'll see how they transpire much sooner than later, as they say. This has been an excellent discussion. Hopefully, I'm not getting too big for my britches here, saying I think this is one of the best that I've had on my channel. It certainly helps having an excellent guest. And so I thank you very much, AM, for taking the time to do this. I'm very much enjoying this history of today's series that we're doing. So thank you for that. Is there anything in closing that you would want to say, upcoming projects or anything else like that, or anything else you want to mention?
Just thank you for having me on. Really, I mean, I muddle through a vast array of historical topics on my channel. If you don't mind listening to me rambling for 3 to 4 hours, then my channel is the right place for you. But other than that, just thank you very much, Semigog, for having me on, and looking forward to further episodes in the series.
Yes, as am I. Everyone, head over to AM's channel. If indeed there are any of you listening who are not subscribed, I expect all of you are quite sensible and will have clicked subscribe over there on his YouTube channel as well as over on Twitter by this point. Hopefully, there are no fools listening, and if there are, you can uh, mitigate your foolishness to some extent by listening to his discussions of history. I myself am behind, but I hope to be able to get over there and watch his recent episode about the fall of the Soviet Union. I'm hearing it, behind the scenes that it was an excellent stream. So please do head over and follow Apostolic Majesty. AM, thank you again. Everyone who has joined us, thank you for being here. I realized there was this big hot thing going on with the Putin interview, which I will eventually get over there and listen to myself. But thank you all for being here and for sticking with us through this stream. Until next time, I'm Semigog, and I am out.